Parmi les multiples interrogations qui reviennent relativement souvent dans vos commentaires, je trouve l'une d'elles particulièrement intéressante. Quand est-ce que nous verrons naître une nouvelle icône du cinéma d'horreur ? Bien sûr, quand vous vous demandez cela, vous pensez à des personnages tels que Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, Chucky, Pinhead, Sadako, Leatherface, etc. Pour moi, c'est un faux débat, car il faut avant tout donner le temps aux films, aux franchises et surtout aux personnages d'obtenir une aura aussi mythique. Cela ne se fait pas en un an ou deux. Et oui, il y a bel et bien de nouvelles icônes, de nouvelles légendes qui sont apparues depuis les années 2000 et qui continuent d'apparaître chaque année. Il faut aussi pouvoir diversifier ses sources et aller rechercher le contenu horrifique au-delà des plateformes grand public, au-delà de Netflix ou des blockbusters hollywoodiens. Et c'est bien souvent là que les pépites inattendues se cachent, un petit peu comme dans nos vidéoclubs d'antan où nous tombions par hasard sur le futur objet de nos pires cauchemars. Et aujourd'hui, c'est d'un film indépendant de ce genre que j'ai envie de vous parler, une petite perle au budget minuscule, mais motivée par un amour du genre indéniable et une véritable envie de bien faire. Le genre de petit film à l'origine de grandes franchises et qui est d'ailleurs bien parti pour le faire ici encore. Et qui, en plus, se déroule durant Halloween. Que demander de mieux ? Bonsoir, amis de l'horreur, aujourd'hui, nous revenons sur Fear Farm de Dante Ioré. Dans Fear Farm, nous suivons 4 jeunes gens, Mélanie, Wendy, Brandon et Rustin, qui, pour fêter Halloween, décident de relever le défi d'un gigantesque labyrinthe de maïs. Coup de bol, en plus, ils arrivent pile au bon moment pour pouvoir profiter d'une superbe offre et d'un challenge encore plus difficile qui les verra potentiellement empocher une magnifique somme d'argent. Évidemment, c'était trop beau pour être vrai. Et malheureusement pour eux, cet endroit est tenu par une famille de psychopathes qui va s'en prendre à eux un par un de façon aussi gore que fun et semble être à la recherche de quelque chose de bien spécial et particulier. Fear Farm est, comme je vous l'ai dit, une toute petite production, mais ça ne se voit pas tant que ça, honnêtement. Déjà, parce qu'ils ont eu la brillante idée, à défaut d'être original, de situer leur intrigue dans un décor tout fait, un labyrinthe de maïs. Un lieu qui, en pleine fête de Halloween, est fait pour être effrayant, pour perdre son spectateur et le faire sursauter au détour d'un virage à l'aide d'un jumpscare audacieux. Une structure qui devient immédiatement méta lorsqu'on l'utilise comme base pour faire un film d'horreur.
So the genesis, the beginning of Fear Farm, really started with Mark S. Allen, who was one of the producers, just trying to come up with a cool location for a film, and he kind of suggested maybe like a haunted house or an abandoned building or a corn maze, and I think he kind of just threw him out a little bit, and then he kind of came back and he was like, actually, I really like the idea of like a corn maze. And then I did some research and I found that in Dixon, California, somehow, which is only from LA, about 5 hours away from LA, unbeknownst to all of us, is the largest corn maze in the world. Like the Guinness, world record. The minute that happened, I hopped on the phone and I called Mark S. Allen. And Mark S. Allen, out of, our producers, we have Howard Bird and Mark S. Allen. Howard Bird is kind of like our, our money guy, our raising funds guy, our getting us distribution deals guy. And Mark S. Allen is like our fixer. Like Mark S. Allen's like the type of guy where like you call him and we're like, hey Mark, we need this. And Mark finds a way to pull it off. And so I called Mark and I was like, hey, this giant 60-acre corn maze exists in Dixon, California. Can you find out if we can film there? And within a couple hours, Mark called me back and he was like, dude, I talked to the owner. He loves the idea. We're in. He'll let us shoot there. And that's kind of what spawned all of that.
Et en effet, quelle chance d'avoir eu un tel endroit pour tourner. Le labyrinthe en question, Cool Patch Pumpkin, a été fondé en 2001 par Matt Cooley et est aujourd'hui considéré comme le plus grand labyrinthe de maïs au monde, selon le livre Guinness des records. Un lieu de rigolade et de plaisir pour les familles qui pourrait se transformer en véritable enfer dès lors qu'il est envahi par des personnages mal intentionnés. Un point de départ parfait pour l'écriture d'un film d'horreur, même si ça peut paraître cliché vu d'ici, et qu'en réalité, ça l'est bel et bien. Mais ça n'est pas là par hasard.
Kind of in the first iteration of Fear Farm, it was just, all right, horror movie, giant corn maze. Like, that's what we had. But then when we kind of got into it, the hard part is like, even though I love horror films, kind of writing a horror film around a corn maze, just doing like your traditional horror, it just, the first draft or two of the script just felt cheesy and corny, but like unintentionally. Like I wasn't trying to make it cheesy and corny, but it just kind of felt that way because it's just kind of this shtick with the corn maze and just horror in general. And so I kind of like flipped that on its head and I was like, you know what, let's turn the whole thing into a horror comedy. Like let's actually poke fun at the things that I'm finding you know, kind of corny or cheesy, and let's lean into those a little bit more. Let's have some fun with that. You know, in movies just growing up, like, you know, a Halloween or, you know, Friday the 13th, you know, a Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In those films, you kind of get to see like a little bit of, you know, those villains, but you never really get to see a look into their like lives, like through the looking glass. And I always thought it'd be interesting, you know, like to see what are these, you know, psychos like, what are these killers like when they're not out hunting people? Like, what are they like just at home, you know, as a family? And do they have the same family dynamic as everybody else? And is there some humor to be found there? And, you know, something human to be found there? So I think that was kind of my big thing was, could I write a script, you know, kind of a horror comedy around a corn maze? You know, could I show you into the lives of the villains of this film? And somewhere along the way, could I get you to actually like or side with the villains? So that was kind of my, you know, foray into Fear Farm.
Voilà donc l'un des grands points forts de Fear Farm, sa famille de psychopathes. Ce sont des clins d'œil aux méchants de slasher iconiques et auxquels nous avons été habitués, mais traités de façon différente, plus humaine, plus drôle aussi, et qui répond en quelque sorte à la question « Tueur de slasher est-il un job à plein temps ?» Fear Farm s'intéresse donc de près à ses antagonistes, les traite de façon respectueuse, plus profonde qu'on pourrait le penser aux premiers abords, et il le fait plus précisément pour deux personnages en particulier. Herschel, le patriarche, interprété par le très bon John Littlefeed, ou alors Gemma, sa fille et star de la famille, jouée par Amy Stolt. Ce sont les deux membres les plus emblématiques d'une famille hommage aux classiques du cinéma d'horreur américain, aux inspirations souvent assez flagrantes et flatteuses. Et ils portent une grande partie du film sur leurs épaules, tant ces personnages sont cool.
I was looking at my main villains, and I knew they worked at this corn maze, kind of this haunted style corn maze. And, you know, their job was to jump out and scare people when they weren't hunting people down, you know, on the day to day. So, you know, when they're not killing people, they're jump scaring people because it's a legit business. And so I tried to look at all those characters and think like, well, it's Halloween, they're dressing up. So I wanted them to dress up similar to villains that they may like, or, you know, movie villains that they may enjoy. And so there's definitely like some inspirations there in that, you know, with Deacon's character, he's our guy on the cover of the DVD and the posters holding the chainsaw. You know, I wanted to, you know, give him a very like chainsaw, Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of vibe, you know. And then we have like some scarecrows. We have a clown that kind of, you know, plays off of Pennywise and It. You know, with Gemma, we kind of have this like Harley Quinn mixed with like a Cupid or a Huntress, just very like, you know, comic book, you know, villain kind of characters that you would see, you know, where they're a little bit seductive and sexy, but they're also like kind of a badass.
I would describe Gemma's personality, aside from the sort of sadistic part, as extremely energetic and playful and fun, with a very serious, smart, determined side. She's definitely a leader and an alpha type of character. I mean, you can really see that in her family dynamic with her brothers. I love the term boogie woman. How I feel about being a boogie woman, scary villain, I don't know. I'm not like that in real life, at least I don't think so. So it's really fun to play in that world in the Fear Farm film as Gemma. Yeah, I feel good about it.
Mais même si ces méchants semblent être l'attrait principal du film, n'allons pas sous-estimer son groupe de gentils. Nous avons donc un petit groupe de 4 jeunes gens qui tiennent ici le rôle de héros, en quelque sorte. Déjà, l'idée de ne mettre que 4 victimes potentielles est plutôt bonne, puisqu'elle permet de nous attarder un petit peu plus sur chacun des protagonistes, et donc de nous attacher plus à eux. Ce qui n'est pas le cas de la chair à canon des Vendredi 13, par exemple, qui, à part pour ces quelques Final Girls et véritables héros, nous propose avant tout des personnages sans intérêt et pour lesquels nous n'éprouverons absolument rien. Ce n'est pas le cas ici, et ce même si nous avons quelques caricatures parmi eux, à l'image de Rustin, joué par Chris Lurie, qui est le rigolo de service, parfois un petit peu lourd, mais qui est franchement marrant la plupart du temps. Sa sœur, Mélanie, interprétée par Tiana Tuttle, est la badass du groupe, une jeune fille un peu plus introvertie que ses camarades, mais qui en a beaucoup plus dans le ventre qu'on pourrait le croire aux premiers abords. Puis, nous avons ce couple, composé de Brandon, le beau gosse un petit peu osef campé par Houston Stevenson, et sa copine Wendy, jouée par Emily Sweet, qui a l'air d'être la blondasse du groupe, la jolie fille un petit peu idiote déguisée en pom-pom girl. Sauf que Wendy est loin d'être bête et sans personnalité, c'est une battante à fort caractère, tandis que Brandon n'est pas le beau gosse stupide et imbu de sa personne auquel les slashers acteurs nous ont habitués. Il y a même ce passage court mais plutôt parlant durant lequel Gemma tente de le charmer de façon plutôt osée et il ne cède absolument pas à ses avances, étant en couple et très heureux comme ça. Cela peut paraître anodin, mais dans les films d'horreur et particulièrement les slashers ou survival pour adolescents auxquels peut ressembler Fear Farm, les choses ne se seraient pas déroulées de la même façon, les 3/4 du temps. Pour toutes ces raisons, il n'est pas forcément évident de déterminer qui est réellement le personnage principal ou qui va mourir et dans quel ordre. Une bonne utilisation des personnages qui est à souligner. Et même ces protagonistes sont finalement des clins d'œil à des clichés répandus dans le cinéma d'horreur.
You know, Wendy, played by Emily Sweet, the gorgeous and talented Emily Sweet, she's awesome. And Emily's character wears a cheerleading outfit in the movie, and she wears it because she was on an audition as a cheerleader because she's an aspiring actress, and then her friends won't let her change and drag her to this corn maze in a cheerleading outfit. But I wanted to kind of write like a backstory to it, 'cause in these horror movies, like the actual, like, you know, 30-day horror movies or whatever people watch, like people are doing that. They're like wearing a cheerleading outfit, but I always wonder, like, why the hell is that person wearing a cheerleading outfit? So I thought in this movie it'd be fun to like look at all those movies and say like, well, let's come up with a reason why somebody would actually do this.
I have to give our director, Dante, a lot of credit because he writes very strong female characters. And when I was reading through the script, you know, Melanie, who was played by Tiana Tuttle, you know, that character is so strong. And I wanted to continue that. I mean, again, not to spoil, but the females go very far in this movie, perhaps further than the gentlemen. And I think that that's really important. And I really wanted to play up that strong female, like, we've got this, we can get through this. I really appreciate that about Dante, that he doesn't just like write, you know, oh, okay, you're blonde, you're gonna be a blonde cheerleader bimbo. No, he writes really strong, empowering female characters.
I would say my main inspirations were Lara Croft, the bride from Kill Bill, and Casey from Atypical. You know, Melanie is such a badass, so of course I wanted to incorporate some of my favorite action stars, which is where Lara Croft and the bride come in. But also, you know, at the end of the day, she's just a young college kid, so I looked to one of my favorite young queer characters, which is Casey from Netflix's Atypical. You know, she's got that tomboyish sort of swagger and that young queer girl energy, so I think those are my three biggest inspirations for this role. You know, I know that I was technically the lead in this movie, but it didn't always feel like that on set. I think because the cast was just so awesome and we all worked off of each other so well, you know, it didn't feel like there was really just one lead. Even though, you know, my character does end up being that lead, it just felt so cohesive and so much like a family. I don't know. It was just an awesome experience overall.
Tiana Tuttle, who plays Melanie, you know, did a fantastic job of that. I mean, she is the badass in this movie, and she, you know, I don't want to give away spoilers, but she's a badass in this movie, and she does a great job. And when, you know, Tiana submitted her self-tape, like, she was spot on for this just like rugged, tough, but still, you know, kind of attractive and not, you know, overly like masculine female, you know, which I thought was like great. It was like, it was so many different layers to it. You know, you didn't just look at this like, you know, kind of Michelle Rodriguez tough girl, where it's like Michelle Rodriguez kind of always looks like she's going to punch you in the face. You know, every time I see her in a movie, where, you know, Tiana had this great job of, you know, she could have these sweet looks and these like innocent looks, and she didn't really look like she could punch you in the face. But then in the movie, she does punch people in the face, and she holds her own, and she looks like she could. And so I thought that was really cool, and I thought it was fun to give a villainess that same idea, and that's where Gemma's character, played by Amy Stolte, kind of came in, was having that same idea, like these two strong females who were gonna butt heads.
Et vous l'aurez plutôt remarqué, mais Fear Farm fait la part belle à ces personnages féminins qui sont tout sauf bateaux, clichés ou insipides. Une réelle volonté du film et de ses auteurs de mettre en avant des protagonistes féminins forts et impressionnants, aussi bien dans le camp des héros que dans celui des antagonistes.
So Fear Farm was the first movie that I wrote and directed. I've done 2 movies since then that I've written and directed, and I've got 2 more coming up in 2021, COVID willing. And in all the movies I've written, I mean, I've tried all of my leads, you know, in my movies and future ones that you guys are gonna see. You know, they all kind of involve these strong, you know, female characters in the leading roles. You know, honestly, I know there's kind of like that whole like, you know, societal thing right now where some people say like that's really important, you know, like, you know, strong female leads, diversity. I didn't really do any of those because it was societally like the right thing to do, even though I think it is. I just did it because you don't see it very often. You know, I know it's kind of happening more, but I just kind of thought like, you know, with Fear Farm, you know, you've got these two girls and these two guys who go in this corn maze and they get picked off along the way. And normally in you know, a horror movie, like the guys are like the strong, tough ones. And I just wanted to kind of flip that on its head. And I was like, well, what if, you know, the girls are the strong, tough ones?
I think that having as many strong female characters as possible is very important. And, you know, I think with more visibility on the incredible strength of women, you know, a phrase like you hit like a girl could maybe become a compliment, you know, because women are so strong. And I think especially for Melanie, you know, she's not just a woman and a strong woman, she's a queer woman. And it's only in recent years that we've even started seeing more queer characters represented on TV and in film. And as a queer woman myself, I think it's really important to represent the people in my community. And, you know, that's strong, independent, badass queer women.
Yeah, you know, it is rare to see a prominent female role in a super villainous family who's also really grounded. One of the things I like about this film is that you're not just cheering for some of the kids to survive. You're actually, I find myself cheering for the family too, and now I could be biased being a part of that family. As far as the choice goes for me to play that role, I mean, I look up to women all the time that I see on the screen. And it's a huge honor and joy to be able to be a part of a project that passes the Bechdel test. And my character in particular just really fights for what she wants, and I love it. It's a great thing. It's one of the things that really attracted me to the script in the first place.
I think it is important. I didn't write this script to kind of check that box, but I wrote the script because I just felt like it was definitely something I wanted to do, and I felt like it was a good time to do it. But I do think that's important, and I think people should do it more. And I think, if anything, watching a movie like Fear Farm is going to let you know that here you have this tough villain, you know, Gemma, and here you have this strong, you know, protagonist in Melanie, and they hold their own on screen, and it's not missing from having men in those roles instead of having women in those roles. And if anything, I think it actually makes it more fun.
Tout cela fait que le film est très drôle et très fun et propose notamment des punchlines vraiment bien tournées, comme ces lignes de dialogue improvisées par Chris Lurie qui laisse Dante admiratif encore maintenant, ou ces habiles clins d'œil parfois parodiques aux célèbres slashers qui, s'ils ne sont pas hilarants, prêtent souvent à sourire. Mais au-delà de cette ambiance bon enfant, Fear Farm est avant tout un vrai film d'horreur et propose son lot d'hémoglobine aux spectateurs amateurs de sang, ainsi que des discours peut-être plus sombres que ce qu'on pourrait croire.
So yes, it's a horror comedy. Yes, a lot of this, you know, makes fun of itself. It doesn't take itself very seriously, but there are certain points in this movie, especially some with Tiana and I, who plays Melanie, where yeah, things get really kind of dark and really deep. And I think that honestly came from because, you know, the four of us, but Tiana and I were so close, and the scene that we were doing was really emotional, and what you saw was real. Tiana and I really, you know, we feel strongly for each other, and that was a really difficult scene, and it is real. And I think that that really helps make Fear Farm, you know, just a well-rounded movie. As I talked about kind of before, like, yeah, you know, it's funny, and yeah, you got the gore and all of that, but it really does do a great job of going deeper, and you like feel for these characters, and you know, you want them to survive. You don't necessarily want them to die, and I think that's really unique and really special.
I definitely think that the film is deeper than it looks. It's kind of this incredible balance. We have some very dramatic moments in there, and I think particularly like Tiana and Emily, without giving anything away, have this wonderful scene, and Tiana has more dramatic scenes. I mean, Rustin, or Chris Leary, who plays Rustin, has like this crazy mixture of comedy, horror, and drama mixed into one. It's one of my favorite scenes in the film. And even John Littlefield, playing Herschel, has like such a depth to him and himself and his character and stuff. I think that there are, in the writing and in the characters, some deeper things and deeper themes, and I'll leave that up to the audience to decide, pick up on or not pick up on, but yeah, for sure there's some deeper levels to it.
Well, I think for me as Melanie, it definitely felt deeper than just a comedy. I mean, there's nothing funny to Melanie about the terrifying things that she's running away from and trying to defeat. But I think especially for the villains, actually, it was a lot deeper than just a comedy, especially for Herschel, who is the patriarch of the family. For him, this is all, like, what he's doing is all for the love and memory of his dead wife, and he's committing and having his children commit all these heinous acts for her memory and to carry on her legacy, and that's definitely really unsettling.
You guys are in another country, so I don't really want to speak to anybody else's country. I'll just speak to mine. Currently in the United States, we are a country of, we're a country of capitalists. Capitalism is our country and the way we run it. And Fear Farm speaks to that a lot. So this family, again, I don't want to give away spoilers, this family is hunting down people. They're hunting them down for a purpose. This purpose is going to make the family money. And that's their whole motivation behind this is, success, rising above, in America, or descending the ladder in a sense. So, kind of the American dream, if you will. And I want to kind of, call out a little bit, just kind of what I see sometimes, not, pointing out names or anything else. I'll kind of keep that to myself, but just about how sometimes, in a country of capitalism, the ends justify the means, meaning that the loss of life isn't really as important as the creation of something, and then people wanting it. And, we kind of see that a little bit. I mean, I'm, filming this on an iPhone, and, child labor laws aren't the best in countries where iPhones are made, without getting too extreme. So it's things like that. We're in a capitalistic country. We kind of know that certain products carry a stigmatism, and they're kind of bad in their practices of how they make a product, but yet we still buy the product because we want the product, and then that company makes a lot of money. And we see it a little bit in the agricultural industry and just other things. Like I said, again, I don't really want to get like political and, soapbox you guys to death. But yeah, I'm definitely speaking to that a little bit in this movie, and just kind of, calling out the pursuit of the American dreams at all costs.
The end is very dark. It sets up a great sequel, and I'm weird because I like when movies don't necessarily have a happy ending. I think that's more real life, and I think it just kind of goes to show that you don't always get what you want in life, and sometimes things don't turn out the way you want. And I don't know if you've ever seen Rob Zombie's, the Firefly family. He does House of a Thousand Corpses and Devil's Rejects and Three from Hell. I mean, that family is very similar to the Walker family in Fear Farm. I think maybe not having such a happy ending in Fear Farm, I think it makes it that much of a better movie.
I think the darkness of that ending is really kind of a reflection of what happens in real life sometimes, where there's just not always a happy ending. Sometimes the bad guys win.
Quand on parle de messages, de discours sous-entendus ou de significations cachées, l'image du labyrinthe peut se révéler très complexe, très symbolique. Et de toute évidence, ce film, qui, du propre aveu de Dante, a été écrit autour de ce labyrinthe de maïs dans un premier temps, utilise d'une façon ou d'une autre la figure, si j'ose dire, du labyrinthe. Voyons ensemble de quelle façon.
This corn maze is so crazy and so giant, and I feel like it kind of ended up becoming a character in and of itself in the movie. And, you know, I think capturing the vastness and the spookiness of that corn maze, it put our production value like way up here.
I can say that this movie has a lot of undertones to it. I don't want to call them all out. Some people have caught them, some people haven't. But at the same point, like, I don't really want to just like throw that out yet, because I think there's a lot of like fun things in there. I mean, there are so many things like buried in the undertone of this movie. I mean, there's shots we set up that mimic popular Reddit memes. There are you know, social and political things we're kind of like poking at. There's personality things we're poking at. There's a lot in there. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there, and I think the corn maze itself kind of does that as well. I don't want to give it away. People can draw their own interpretations. Maybe a couple months from now or something, once it's been out for a while, you guys can circle back with me and I'll kind of get into that a little bit more. I kind of like the audience being able to watch it and kind of come to their own conclusions a little bit about, you know, the underlining things I'm kind of saying. And then, yeah, we can talk about it another time. But there's definitely stuff in there. And if you pay attention really closely, there is a lot of little things you'll pick up on.
Pour ma part, si je devais donner mon avis sur ce que représente le labyrinthe dans Fear Farm, je dirais qu'il représente parfaitement bien nos sociétés occidentales et particulièrement la société américaine. Dante parlait lui-même du capitalisme et c'est assez flagrant dans le film. Nos 4 personnages se laissent tenter dans l'aventure par une récompense alléchante, à savoir une forte somme d'argent. Pour essayer de l'obtenir, ils se séparent et empruntent chacun une route censée en amener un parmi eux jusqu'à la fortune. D'une part, c'est une belle représentation du rêve américain entretenu par la société. Plusieurs routes seraient soi-disant possibles à emprunter vers ce tel rêve, la gloire et la richesse, mais aucune ou presque n'arrive réellement à destination, à l'image de ce labyrinthe qui n'emmène ses participants qu'à la mort. Un piège qui utilise la promesse de richesse pour tromper ses utilisateurs, à l'image d'un système qui utilise la carotte pour nous pousser à l'entretenir. Au-delà de ça, ce labyrinthe représente et dénonce bien le contrôle rigide sociétal entretenu autour de la population. Il nous pousse à emprunter certaines routes, à tel point que lorsque les personnages sont poursuivis par des tueurs, au lieu de s'engouffrer à travers le champ de maïs même pour tenter de se cacher ou fuir, ils continuent de courir sur cet unique chemin qui ne leur promet rien d'autre qu'une mort certaine, à l'exception de notre héroïne badass et marginale, femme queer, qui, elle, a l'audace de sortir des sentiers battus, des chemins tracés pour la piéger, et traverse le labyrinthe à travers le maïs, ne respectant pas les règles qu'on a tenté de lui imposer. Un authentique symbole. Autre métaphore du capitalisme, cette famille de tueurs à la tête d'un business qui est une excuse pour procéder à leurs exactions inhumaines. Bah oui, business is business, et l'argent justifie les moyens, à l'image des grandes sociétés dont parlait Dante. Voilà pourquoi le personnage de Herschel a notamment été inspiré par ces vendeurs de téléachat, ces émissions destinées à nous faire acheter des babioles sans intérêt, des bonimenteurs qui poussent à la consommation, encore une fois, tout un symbole de l'esprit de nos sociétés occidentales actuelles. Herschel est un chef d'entreprise avant même d'être un tueur, et c'est bien sûr une analogie facile à comprendre pour nous, artistes ou prolos, classe moyenne ou pauvres. Mais bien entendu, il y a certainement plein d'autres choses à lire et à comprendre dans Fear Farm, et je serais intéressé d'avoir vos propres conclusions en commentaire, et mon petit doigt me dit que Dante vous lira certainement, donc n'hésitez pas à donner vos avis. Mais le labyrinthe, ce ne sont pas seulement des symboliques, c'est également des conditions de tournage bien particulières, pour les techniciens comme pour les comédiens. Déjà, c'est un lieu bien particulier, que ce soit au niveau de sa disposition ou de son esthétique, donc, pour en tirer le meilleur à l'image, il faut pouvoir en profiter de façon bien particulière, comme nous allons le voir ensemble. Mais ensuite, cela implique également des conditions pas forcément évidente, notamment parce que cela implique un tournage en extérieur et souvent nocturne. Bah oui, nous sommes dans un film d'horreur tout de même. Mais cela aura également permis quelques anecdotes bien croustillantes.
The shooting for Fear Farm was everything except for simple. So, Fear Farm was shot on a tighter budget, a smaller budget. It was an independent film. It was, personally financed by a couple people. And in doing that, the one thing that you kind of get stuck with is the fact that you're going to have a shorter shooting schedule. So Fear Farm was shot in 9.5 days is what we shot the movie in. And so trying to shoot an entire movie in 9.5 days is a mission in itself, because after 9.5 days, we run out of money. So that was pretty tricky just because there were a lot of moving parts, a lot of things we had to do, and we had 9.5 days to pull it off. Beyond that, the other thing with Fear Farm is there were a couple things that go into it. One, we had never shot in a corn maze before, or in corn for that general. I've never shot in corn, neither did my director of photography, David Minadio, and shooting in the corn was problemsome. I don't know why we thought this, but we thought for some reason we could shoot like hard light and it would just break through the corn and it would look epic, and it actually doesn't work that way. Corn reacts like a wall reacts. Like basically shooting light at it, it doesn't do anything. Like it doesn't shoot through the corn, it just kind of stops at the corn. So it kind of made a logistical nightmare a little bit because these corn stalks are anywhere from 9 feet to 12 feet tall. And so now we have to get all these lights like taller than the corn. And then beyond that, we're out in this giant corn maze that has no electricity. So now we've got to run generators and, you know, run electricity and power to all of these lights. So that made it troublesome. We were doing overnight shoots, so 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. most days. So we were just doing, you know, sundown to sun up. So that was hard on everybody. You know, still fun, but, you know, definitely tricky. Just doing that overnight schedule, getting your body into that nocturnal schedule is really difficult. And the last thing that I didn't anticipate, and I don't think any of us ever thought of, was the fact that with the corn maze, we went there at the end of October, and in Dixon, California, where the corn maze is, it's actually freezing there at night. So we were out and the temperature was like 20 degrees, 18 degrees. So it was freezing, and our poor actors, especially like, you know, Amy Stolte, who plays Gemma, Emily Sweet, who plays Wendy, like, you know, Emily's in a cheerleading outfit, you know, Amy's in these like booty shorts and like a cut off fishnet like style shirt, and it's freezing, and these poor girls had to act in this and act like it was warm and act like it was normal, and then in between takes we would have to have somebody run in just like giant jackets because they were just shivering out there.
One of my favorites, I think, was that we kept losing Houston Stevenson, who played Brandon, my boyfriend in the film. We would be walking a set and we would be going through the cornfields, and we would, you know, we would all make it, and then someone would be like, well, where's Houston? And we'd be like, he was right behind us. I don't know where he is. And then, you know, we would go back, Houston, Houston, just running around trying to find Houston. And, you know, we would eventually find him in the cornfield, just taking videos or pictures for social media. We were like, we thought we lost you. We didn't know where you were. And also just, I think, you know, we were all very supportive. We were all there for each other. Even if we weren't filming that day, we would still go to set to show our support, which is rare, I think, and very unique. But so it was freezing at nighttime. I mean, it got down to 17 degrees. It was cold. So I love just remembering in between takes when one of us was filming, when, you know, Dante would yell cut, we would all run out to the actor, you know, our friend, our actor, and cover him or her and, you know, blankets or jackets or whatever, and just like, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, you got this, you're doing so great, you're amazing, you're awesome.
There's a scene at a farmer's market, and we genuinely were set up at a farmer's market with this product that I don't want to give away in case anyone hasn't seen the film yet. And we actually were shooting, but some of the, you know, people walking around at the farmer's market didn't realize we were filming a movie, because we kind of just were sort of guerrilla styling it. And we actually had people come up and try and buy the product, and we had to tell them that, no, this is a fake product. And they would argue with us about not being allowed to buy the product, genuinely coming into the shots doing that. So that was interesting. I tried to stay in character the whole time.
So on the paintball day, which was the day that we were, you know, in the back of that truck with all the paintball guns. Well, first of all, that was just as fun as it seemed. It was super fun being on the back of that thing. But part of that scene was that Herschel, who was driving the truck, would stop at these little inlets where there was these, you know, people dressed up as zombies, and we were supposed to essentially shoot them down with the paintball guns. And one of the zombies was actually our producer, Mark, who was dressed up in all of the gear. And, you know, when you watch the film, you'll see that my brother, Rustin, says something about shooting the zombies in a certain region. And we definitely did exactly that. And Mark totally got the brunt of it. And he jokes that he still has the bruises to this day. And so, you know, I don't think I'll have another opportunity in the future of shooting at one of my producers with paintball guns like that. It was definitely a unique experience.
Enfin bon, tout ça c'est bien beau, mais Fear Farm c'est également et même surtout un film de Halloween. Et en général, ce genre d'œuvre a une ambiance, une atmosphère particulière qui fait qu'on va d'autant plus apprécier les regarder durant cette période ô combien spéciale.
Halloween is my favorite holiday. I look forward to it every year. I count down. I love Halloween. And this is definitely a good Halloween movie because it's new. It's unique. The story is so unique. And it also, though, ties in different classic horror films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You know, it really does have roots like the classics, but it has a fresh new take on it. And so you have the gore, you have the jump scares. It's perfect for Halloween.
I think what makes Fear Farm a great Halloween movie is the fact that it's set during the Halloween season. We went and filmed at that corn maze during Halloween time when it was actually open to the public for people going and, you know, trying to get into the Halloween mood and all of that. And so I think that's part of what makes it a really great film for that particular season. And, you know, any horror film is always going to be great for the spooky season, as they say. But particularly this year with the pandemic, you know, we can't necessarily go out and do the same things that we would normally do to go celebrate a holiday like Halloween. So I think that having this movie that can kind of be, you know, a bit of an escape to a time when we could go with a huge group of our friends and do something fun like a corn maze, you know, was possible. But, you know, I hope in real life you're not getting chased down by psycho killers, so.
Okay, well, I mean, Fear Farm's whole concept is based during Halloween, so our characters are actually experiencing their form of Halloween during Fear Farm. So I guess it plays into that moment. It's kind of like watching a Christmas movie during Christmas. So I guess that would be, you know, point number one. Point number two, there's blood, guts, and mayhem. So, you know, normal Halloween movie. You know, point number three, there's jump scares. Point number four, it's funny. We're kind of, you know, I have friends that do this thing every Halloween where for every day of October, they watch a different horror movie. And I always, you know, kind of, when, you know, writing Fear Farm, I always kind of thought about that. Like my friends who watch, like, you know, every day of October, they watch a horror movie. And I thought how fun it would be to kind of poke fun a little bit at all those movies that they're watching a little bit and kind of show that even though those movies are kind of taken seriously, that there is some, like, corniness to them, even though they're not trying to be. And I think Fear Farm kind of plays into that.
À mes yeux, Fear Farm est un véritable bol d'air frais. Nous voyons fréquemment des œuvres qui se veulent des hommages aux classiques du genre ou qui surfent sur les tendances horrifiques du moment. Je pense que, finalement, Fear Farm n'est ni l'un ni l'autre, car ce qui est vraiment bien, c'est qu'il a sa propre patte, il trouve sa propre voix. Son ton est bien particulier et, même si je pense pour ma part qu'il est beaucoup plus proche de l'horreur que de la comédie en tant que telle, son ton fun, qui ne sera pas sans vous rappeler des films comme La cabane dans les bois ou Les Firefly de Rob Zombie, comme le disait si bien Emily, est réellement rafraîchissant et colle bien à l'ambiance de Halloween que le film cherche à instaurer. Techniquement, malgré son manque de moyens, le film réussit, aussi bien au niveau de la photographie de David Minadeo, qui a su, malgré les difficultés, parfaitement capter ce gigantesque labyrinthe et en faire un environnement aussi intrigant que terrifiant, que de la mise en scène, tirant le maximum de ses comédiens, tous franchement convaincants, qui ont apprécié tourner ce film ensemble, et ça se ressent. L'alchimie entre tous les membres de l'équipe crève les yeux, et bien sûr, l'écran avec. Dante, mais également ses co-scénaristes et producteurs Mark Allen et Howard Bird, savaient pertinemment que dans les faits, leur intrigue était cliché et convenue au possible. Ils se sont justement servis de ces clichés pour, au contraire, surprendre le spectateur à explorer des idées différentes, ou plutôt un point de vue différent de cette histoire que nous pensions avoir déjà vue ou lue tant de fois. Et ça, c'est honnêtement un tour de force qui vaut à lui seul le coup d'œil. Et il n'est donc guère étonnant d'apprendre que le deuxième film a déjà été tourné et est en post-prod à l'instant même où vous regardez cette vidéo. De plus, Dante Yore, qui a également signé un thriller horrifique qui arrivera l'année prochaine nommé 6 616 Wilford Lane et une série live Scooby-Doo intitulée Mystery Inc. et dont vous pouvez d'ores et déjà trouver le trailer sur YouTube, a annoncé qu'il y aura probablement au moins 2 autres suites à Fear Farm, voire plus. C'est une authentique nouvelle franchise qui est née avec ce petit film sans prétention et qui sera peut-être à l'origine de nouvelles icônes comme Herschel et sa fille Gemma par exemple. Autant vous dire que j'ai apprécié le film, qui bien sûr n'est pas exempt de défauts, mais au contraire est bien conscient de ses qualités comme de ses moins bons points, et arrive à en tirer parti pour se démarquer des autres films du même genre. Et pour finir de vous convaincre de donner une chance à ce film, je laisse le mot de la fin à Dante et ses actrices de choc, qui m'ont fait l'honneur immense de participer à ma modeste vidéo, et que je remercie bien sûr très chaudement. Merci beaucoup à vous.
You know, everyone involved in Fear Farm is so talented and so amazing and just so wonderful, and I am so thankful that I was able to be a part of something so memorable and, you know, so fun and so great. It's such an amazing film, and I can't wait for everyone to watch it. For everyone who has, thank you so much for supporting us. For those who are about to watch it, thank you. I hope you enjoy. I know you will. It's such a great, great, great movie. Feel free to let me know your thoughts. I can be reached on Instagram at It's Emily Sweet. I would love to know what you thought of the film. Loved it, hate it, that's okay. But I know you're gonna love it.
What I would consider some of the main strengths of Fear Farm. Overall, I think it has a lot to do with, it's gonna sound really cheesy, but kind of the magic of the team. The collaboration of everyone and the excitement and passion, the heart that everyone brought into this project is pretty amazing. I think you can see it on the film and the chemistry with the amazing characters that were written by Dante Yor, Marcus Allen, and Howard Bird. Dante Yor is also our director. And then of course beautifully captured by our DP David Minadio, who did an amazing job in that crazy corn maze. But the actors and the characters just seemed seamlessly interconnected, whether it's the 4 kids running around. We've got Emily Sweet, Tiana Tuttle, Houston Stevenson, and Chris Leary, who all have an amazing dynamic together. As far as my perspective from playing Gemma, I loved working with John Littlefield. I think he's extremely magical to watch on the screen. And really fun. And my incredible, huge monstrosity of brothers. We've got Seven, who's at least 7 feet tall. Carl Jackson, who bakes some amazing peanut butter cookies in the film. We've got Isaiah Patterson. We've got Mike Valentine and Mario Rocha, who all just help complete this incredible family dynamic of a horror film.
Well, one, if you like horror and comedy, you're gonna like Fear Farm. But beyond that, I would just say that, you know, in Fear Farm, I have to give praise to John Littlefield. John Littlefield is an amazing actor. I've worked with him now on 3 different movies because I keep casting him because he's brilliant. John Littlefield plays Herschel Walker, and he is our lead antagonist in this movie. You've seen him in the trailers already if you're watching Fear Farm, and his performance alone is worth watching Fear Farm, if no other reason than to just see John Littlefield play Herschel Walker. Watch this movie because John is brilliant, and he does an incredible job. Beyond that, the rest of the cast does a brilliant job too. Mario Rocha, who plays Andy, oh, so good. He plays the creepy clown and one of the brothers. You know, Amy Stolte plays Gemma. Carl, who plays Deacon. Seven, you know, Brandon, Seven. We call him Seven because he's 7, you know, feet tall, and that's kind of his nickname, but Brandon is his real name. He does a great job as one of the brothers as well. You know, there's Pat, who does a great job. Mike Valentine, who plays Jack, who just does a great job. You know, Houston. Chris Leary, he plays Rustin in the movie. Brilliant at improv. Some of these great funny lines in Fear Farm I wrote. I'm very proud of them. Some of them Chris Leary just came up with on the day because he's just an improv genius, and you know, it's hard to tell sometimes what I wrote and what he wrote, and that's what I love about him, is the fact he was able to understand the character so well that he could bring new jokes to the character and did a great job. You know, Emily Sweet, Tiana Tuttle. I mean, everybody in this movie did a brilliant, brilliant job, you know. And John Littlefield definitely is the anchor to all of that. You know, Herschel Walker is kind of the anchor to all of that. So I definitely think, like, just watch it for that. Watch it for the performances. Watch it for the fun. Watch it for some good jump scares, some good blood and guts. You know, a weird movie where the ending, you know, and why this family's doing it is kind of out there. But beyond that, just, you know, watch it because, you know, John Littlefield delivers this amazing performance as Herschel Walker. And everybody who's seen the movie, you know, loves Herschel Walker. They love Gemma, you know, played by Amy Stolte. And they love, you know, Melanie, played by Tiana Tuttle. And those three, you know, performances that are your three, you know, main leads in this movie really, I think, you know, make this definitely something to take the time to watch. So give it a look.
N'oubliez pas, amis de l'horreur, que le cinéma d'horreur, avant d'être les blockbusters horrifiques que beaucoup d'entre vous apprécient au plus haut point, c'est d'abord les petites productions, ces séries B ou ces films d'exploitation offerts par ces auteurs, ces artisans du cinéma qui ont appris à faire avec les moyens du bord. Ce sont eux qui forgent l'authentique cinéma d'horreur, eux que l'on peut rencontrer partout dans le monde, notamment avec les différents festivals, eux qui nous ont offert certains des plus grands classiques du genre, et ont donc forgé d'une certaine façon le cinéma d'horreur que nous aimons tant. Soutenons les plus petits artistes et partageons leur travail, surtout quand nous l'apprécions. J'espère que vous aurez apprécié cette vidéo un petit peu particulière. Passez un bon Halloween et dans tous les cas, on se retrouve bientôt pour une prochaine vidéo. Et d'ici là, surtout n'oubliez pas, si vous avez peur, c'est que vous êtes toujours en vie.